The low hum of fluorescent lights stretched across the quiet hospital corridor, blending with the distant murmur of medical equipment and hushed conversations. It was late afternoon, and most visitors had already gone home, leaving the ward with stillness and anticipation. In room 214, Nurse Hannah Winters stood by the doorway, her heart unexpectedly heavy. She was new to this small-town hospital at the edge of rolling farmland, just a few miles from the interstate. The staff here were friendly enough, but something about the case she'd just been assigned made her nervous. Inside the room, a patient lay silent and unmoving. Mrs. Clara Anderson, a once vibrant woman now caught in a mysterious vegetative state. Hannah had read through the chart multiple times, turning the pages back and forth, searching for answers that were nowhere to be found. The official story suggested a tragic accident, one that robbed Mrs. Anderson of her voice, her laughter, and her ability to connect with the world around her. But some details didn't line up. Cryptic notations in her file, unusual medication shifts, and subtle discrepancies that Hannah, with her fresh set of eyes, couldn't overlook. Standing at the foot of the bed, Hannah studied the dimly lit monitors and tried to make sense of it all. The doctors said Mrs. Anderson's condition was stable, but stable wasn't progress, and something about their guarded expressions told Hannah that answers wouldn't come quickly. She felt a lingering presence behind the scenes, like invisible hands tugging at invisible threads. Who stood to gain from keeping Mrs. Anderson locked in this unresponsive state? And why did the slightest mention of the patient's past cause certain staff members to tense, as though protecting a secret? Before we dive deeper into this twisted and unexpected journey, before we start peeling back the layers of a carefully concealed truth, I want you to know that your presence here matters. This isn't just another hospital drama. This is a story about unraveling the unknown, challenging what we're told, and believing in the power of quiet determination. If you find yourself intrigued and want to join me as we navigate these corridors of uncertainty, please consider subscribing to this channel. Many nights will be ahead, filled with hushed whispers and guarded files, as we attempt to shine a light on what's been hidden in the shadows. So, let's step forward together. The truth, though elusive, is waiting to be discovered. The FH arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor the following day. The world outside was still waking, the faint scent of coffee drifting from the nurse's lounge, the low hum of floor scrubbers polishing the linoleum. As she approached room 214, she let out a slow breath, bracing herself for another day with Mrs. Anderson. Yesterday's unsettled feeling lingered. She couldn't help but wonder what delicate truths lay buried within those patient files and who might guard them. A soft glow seeped through the window blinds, illuminating Mrs. Anderson's peaceful face. On the surface, everything was calm and routine. Heart monitor steady, drip carefully calibrated, feeding tube secure. But Hannah's eyes drifted to a framed family photograph placed beside the bed. 3 smiling faces at what looked like a summer picnic. Clara Anderson, radiating warmth, her husband, Michael, grinning broadly, and a teenage girl, likely their daughter, caught mid-laugh as if someone had told a joke just before the shutter clicked. Hannah felt a slight ache in her chest. How many visitors had come to see Mrs. Anderson since the accident? So far, no one, and that silence spoke volumes. Hannah was checking the medication log when she sensed a presence behind her. Turning, she met the gaze of Dr. Howard, the physician overseeing Mrs. Anderson's care. He was a tall man in his late 50s, with kind but tired eyes and a subtle stoop to his shoulders. He seemed surprised to find Hannah there so early. "Everything all right, Hannah?" he asked, voice hushed, as though raising it might disturb the patient's delicate stillness. "Yes, doctor," she replied, slipping the log back onto the bedside table. "I wanted to review her vitals from last night. I thought I noticed a small spike in her blood pressure around 3 a.m. Dr. Howard glanced at the monitors, brow furrowing ever so slightly. "A minor fluctuation, most likely, but I appreciate your diligence. Keep noting anything unusual, no matter how small." Hannah nodded. She'd read enough patient charts to know that small details could lead to significant discoveries. Still, something in Dr. Howard's tone suggested caution, as if he expected her to follow instructions without probing too deeply. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but there was a subtle tension, like a taut string just waiting to snap. Later that same afternoon, as Hannah adjusted Mrs. Anderson's pillows and gently massaged her hands to promote circulation, the door opened again. A man stood at the threshold, tall, with silver streaks in his hair, suit jacket slightly rumpled as though he'd been traveling. His eyes moved slowly around the room, landing on Hannah and then flickering toward the patient's still form. He gave a thin, almost apologetic smile. "I'm Michael Anderson," he said, voice tight. "Clara's husband." Hannah introduced herself softly, explaining her role and the nature of Mrs. Anderson's condition. Michael nodded, his eyes fixed on his wife's face, searching for something. Recognition, perhaps, or comfort. He stepped closer to the bed and took Clara's hand. "I'm sorry I haven't been here sooner," he murmured, knuckles turning white as he gripped her hand. "Work obligations. And I guess I've been struggling to face this." His voice, though low, carried a tremor that cut through Hannah's heart. Hannah wanted to offer reassurances, but a lump rose in her throat. Was it indeed work that kept him away, or something more complicated? She said nothing, only observed. His gaze lingered on the 4 lines, the gentle hum of the heart monitor, as if these machines were both saviors and jailers. There was love and pain in his eyes, but also something else, unease, perhaps even guilt. Before leaving, Michael turned to Hannah. "Thank you for taking care of her," he said quietly. "I know this can't be easy." Hannah smiled gently. "I want to do everything I can for her. Please let me know if I can do anything to make this easier for you too." After he left, the room felt heavier, as though his presence had stirred old dust from the corners. Hannah wondered about their life together. What dreams had Clara once nurtured? What led up to the accident that trapped her in this silent state? The medical records hadn't told the whole story, nor did Dr. Howard. And Michael's hesitation raised more questions than answers. Hannah found herself craving a fuller portrait of Clara Anderson, not just the tragic figure in this bed, but the person behind those lovely family smiles. In the following days, Hannah settled into a rhythm while sifting through subtle clues like a detective. She maintained a polite professionalism with Dr. Howard, asking careful questions about treatment plans and monitoring medication logs for any irregularities. She noticed that some prescriptions had changed hands multiple times, signed off by various doctors before Dr. Howard took over. Why so many shifts and oversight? As Hannah tidied the side table one afternoon, she discovered a small notebook behind a cluster of wilted flowers. Its cover was worn and stained, the pages slightly yellowed. Inside were handwritten notes, short, delicate entries that seemed to belong to Clara herself. They described everyday moments: lunch with a friend, a phone call with her daughter in college, a heated discussion with Michael about some investment he'd made without consulting her. Nothing too revealing, yet Hannah sensed these entries were building to something. The handwriting grew shakier over the last few pages, and the tone became more anxious. "Someone is watching," one of the entries read. "I can't shake the feeling that I'm in danger, but I don't know who to trust." Hannah's heart fluttered. This was more than an ordinary accident. It might have been deliberate. But who would want to harm a kind-hearted woman from a small community? She thought of Dr. Howard's cautious demeanor, Michael's delayed arrival, and the noticeable absence of other family members. She considered that someone on the medical staff might be involved, or that financial gain could blur behind the scenes. The hospital's corridors were filled with passing faces, nurses and doctors who came and went were most kind and dedicated, but perhaps not all had good intentions. That evening, Hannah confronted Dr. Howard with some of her questions. She found him in his office, a cramped space filled with medical journals and patient files. He looked up from his desk, startled to see her standing there, and quickly closed a folder he'd been reading. "Hannah, is something wrong?" She stepped inside, closing the door quietly. "I've been reviewing Mrs. Anderson's files and her medication history. I've noticed several changes in her prescriptions over the past months and some unusual timing around certain treatments. I'm concerned there might be factors we're overlooking." Dr. Howard leaned back, his eyes guarded. "Hannah, you're dedicated, but you're new here. Our patient histories are often complex, and not all details are straightforward. Trust me, everything is under control." But Hannah couldn't let it rest. I've also found personal notes that suggest Clara Anderson feared someone meant her harm before her condition deteriorated. I think we should investigate. Something flickered in the doctor's gaze for a split second. Surprise, perhaps even alarm. Then it vanished, replaced by professional calm. Hannah, I understand your concern. I'll review the case thoroughly once more. But please be careful not to jump to conclusions. It wouldn't help anyone, least of all our patients. Walking back to Mrs. Anderson's room, Hannah felt the weight of the unanswered questions pressing against her lungs, making her breathing harder. In the darkened hallway, she passed Dr. Carter, another physician who had often been seen checking on patients late at night. He cast her a quick, unreadable glance. She offered a polite nod, and he moved on without a word. How many people had a stake in Clara Anderson's condition? Later, as she stood by the bed, Hannah spoke softly to Mrs. Anderson, hoping the patient could hear him on some level. I know you're in there, and I believe you were trying to tell someone what happened before everything went silent. I won't give up. I promise I'll do everything I can to find the truth. And there Hannah remained a quiet sentinel in the half-light, determined to bring this tangled web of secrets into the open. The hush of the hospital now felt charged with possibility. Beneath the sterile surfaces and polite smiles, hidden motives were at play, and Hannah was prepared to follow every last thread, no matter how far it led or how dangerous it became. A cool autumn breeze whispered through the cracked windows along the hospital's back corridors in the following days. Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that every step she took echoed in ears she couldn't see. The more she learned, the more she wondered who might be watching. She decided it was time to speak with Michael Anderson again. He had seemed hesitant before, but perhaps the notes she'd found, Clara's quiet pleas for help, would unlock a more candid conversation. Hannah chose a late afternoon, knowing Michael usually visited after finishing his day's business. She found him in room 214, seated beside his wife. Clara's lashes remained still, her breathing even, but something in the atmosphere felt charged. As Hannah approached, Michael rose, smoothing the front of his suit jacket. He looked as though he hadn't slept well, dark shadows beneath his eyes. Mr. Anderson, Hannah began carefully, I realize this is difficult, but I've come across something that might be important. She opened the small notebook and went to the page where Clara had written about being watched. Your wife recorded her fears here. Fears that someone intended her harm. His jaw tightened, and he moved closer, shoulders hunched to protect Clara from unseen threats. Clara was never the sort to imagine danger, he said softly, voice hoarse. If she wrote this, she must have had a reason. He paused, struggling to find the right words. Before her accident, Clara was worried about a series of strange withdrawals from our joint account. Money disappearing, investments rerouted. We argued because she wanted answers, and I told her I would handle it. But I never got the chance before. Before this happened, Hannah's pulse quickened. Financial irregularities, combined with Clara's suspicion of being watched. This was no ordinary tragedy. Mr. Anderson, if Clara suspected foul play, we need to consider the possibility that someone used this hospital stay to keep her silent. Have you spoken with any investigators or considered reporting these financial discrepancies to the authorities? He ran a hand through his graying hair and sighed. I was afraid of making baseless accusations, and after Clara's accident, I lost my nerve. But you're right. I can't just stand by and hope things fix themselves. He lifted his chin, meeting Hannah's gaze. I'll ask a private investigator I know to look into the financial side. Maybe you can keep an eye on what's happening here. I need tangible proof if someone on the medical team is involved. Hannah agreed. As Michael left, she felt solidarity. It was no longer just her, a lone nurse, trying to untangle this puzzle. Yet the hospital halls still felt thick with secrets. Hannah recalled Dr. Howard's dismissive stance, his gentle but firm warning not to jump to conclusions. Then, there was Dr. Carter, whose silent presence and wary glance had set her nerves on edge, who benefited from keeping Clara in limbo. After her shift ended that evening, Hannah lingered in the hospital library, a small, rarely used room lined with outdated medical texts. She skimmed through staff rosters and old memos. Amid the dust motes drifting in the lamplight, She learned Dr. Carter had taken over some of Clara's initial treatments before Dr. Howard assumed primary care. There were discrepancies in the medication schedule during Dr. Carter's brief oversight. Minor changes, but enough to raise an eyebrow. Hannah jotted down her observations, heart heavy with the burden of suspicion. The following week brought an unsettling change in the hospital's mood. News that Dr. Howard was reviewing certain patient files had somehow spread, and Hannah noticed her colleagues' behavior shift. Some nurses grew uneasy, ducking out of conversations or changing the subject whenever Mrs. Anderson's name came up. A junior resident, Dr. Patel, seemed about to say something important in the break room before swallowing his words and hurrying off. Something about the entire environment felt charged with unspoken tension. Meanwhile, Michael Anderson's private investigator had begun digging into the family's finances and hinted at troubling leads. A shell company linked to one of the hospital's suppliers, unusual insurance claims filed shortly after Clara's admission. On the phone one evening, Michael sounded both hopeful and scared. "Hannah," he said quietly, "I think someone stood to gain from Clara's silence. Money, property, something bigger than I imagined. The investigator discloses the exact connection. Stay alert, and don't trust everyone at that hospital." Hannah hung up, nerves buzzing. She had noticed Dr. Carter lurking around room 214 after hours. While Hannah finished her notes one night, Dr. Carter slipped in, checked Clara's foreline, and slipped out without a greeting. When Hannah confronted him in the hallway, he offered a thin smile. "Routine checks," he said flatly. His eyes, however, didn't quite meet hers. Hannah sensed that beneath his calm exterior churned the weight of secrets. Determined to protect Clara, Hannah asked the charge nurse for permission to adjust her schedule so she could spend more extended periods monitoring Mrs. Anderson's care personally. She also began documenting every medication administered, double-checking each vial and pill. And whenever the hospital grew quiet, after most of the staff had gone home, Hannah would sit by Clara's bedside and speak softly about the day's events. She talked about the investigator, banding out the faint clues they were piecing together, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that Olara could hear and find comfort in these efforts. On some level, one evening, as Hannah gently combed Clara's hair, something unusual happened. Clara's index finger twitched, just once, against the bedsheet. Hannah froze, observing. A second twitch. Her heart soared. Was this a mere reflex or a glimmer of responsiveness? She leaned in. "Hushed but urgent, Clara. If you're in there, give me another sign." The room remained silent, the only response the quiet hum of machines. Yet Hannah refused to dismiss it. She had been trained to know involuntary spasms, but this felt different. A delicate, deliberate tap that left Hannah more confident than ever that Clara's mind still reached outward, imprisoned but not defeated. Galvanized by this hint of life, Hannah contacted Michael and told him about the movement. His gratitude and hope were palpable through the phone line. "Keep faith," he said. "We're close to understanding who would do this to her. If we find the truth, it may help her find her way back to us." Hannah's resolve hardened as the autumn air grew cooler and dusk fell earlier each day. She spent her off hours researching hospital guidelines, reading legal precedents, and brushing up on signs of patient neglect or worse. She took meticulous notes, building a quiet case of her own. Whoever was behind this had expected their victim to remain silent forever, locked inside her mind. But fate had placed Hannah here, with her keen eyes and loyal heart, refusing to let the darkness stand unchallenged. The conspirators didn't know Hannah was prepared to shine a light beneath every closed door and locked cabinet until their carefully constructed facade shattered like glass. The tension coiled tighter with each passing day, and Hannah could sense that when it all snapped, it would do so dramatically. The stakes had grown higher, and soon, the hidden truths would have to face the sharp clarity of daylight. As weeks slipped into a late October chill, the hospital's corridors seemed to grow quieter, as if bracing themselves for an approaching storm. Hannah arrived one morning to find Mrs. Anderson's room unexpectedly rearranged. Vases moved, the family photo tilted, and a new type of feeding solution attached to the four-pole. No one had notified her of any changes. She felt a tingling of anxiety at the base of her neck. A quick check of the patient's chart showed nothing unusual documented. It was too neat, too clean. Something here didn't add up. Hannah compared the past week's medical logs, taking them into a corner of the nurse's station. Flipping through notes, she found discrepancies when certain drugs were administered. When placed side by side, some entries contradicted, citing slightly different dosages or administration times. A casual observer would easily miss these subtle variations, but Hannah's careful eye caught the pattern. Whoever altered these records had grown bolder and sloppier, as though confident no one would bother to look closely. That afternoon, Hannah approached Dr. Howard again. She chose her words carefully, aware that any misstep might cause him to shut down. "Dr. Howard," she began, holding the chart against her chest, "I've been reviewing Mrs. Anderson's logs. There are inconsistencies in her medication schedule. I think someone's manipulating her treatment plan." He sighed, closed the patient file he'd been reading, and pressed his fingertips together. "Hannah, I warned you not to jump to conclusions. Still, you do seem certain." He adjusted his glasses and looked around as if ensuring they were alone. "Let me see what you found." As Hannah laid out the discrepancies, Dr. Howard's brow knit tighter with each page turned. His silence was telling. "This is concerning," he said at last, voice barely above a whisper. "These changes aren't trivial. They could impact her neurological responses or maintain her perpetually unresponsive state." He swallowed, eyes clouded. "All right, I'll start my investigation." "But Hannah," he met her gaze firmly, "you must be cautious. We don't know who's behind this and can't afford to spook them prematurely." His acknowledgement stirred hope in Hannah's heart. Perhaps Dr. Howard could be an ally after all. She recalled how reticent he had been before, but maybe that was due to caution rather than collaboration. For now, she would trust him. She needed help if they were going to unearth the truth and protect Clara. That evening, as the hospital lights dimmed and visitors thinned out, Hannah checked on Mrs. Anderson. Sitting beside her patient, she spoke softly. "Clara, we're making progress. People are helping now. If you can hear me, hang in there. Your voice will be heard." She brushed a strand of Clara's hair aside and noted a soft tension in the patient's jaw. Was it her imagination? Or did Clara's breathing shift slightly as Hannah spoke of hope? The corridor outside felt unsettlingly calm. Hannah stepped out and nearly bumped into Dr. Carter. He regarded her with a measured stare, hands tucked into the pockets of his white coat. "Working late again, Hannah?" he asked, voice too casual, his smile not reaching his eyes. Hannah mustered a polite nod. "Yes, just making sure our patients are well cared for." "Of course," he said, leaning forward just enough that Hannah caught a faint hint of his aftershave. "Your dedication is admirable." Then he turned away, walking off with slow, deliberate steps. Watching him disappear around the corner, Hannah's pulse quickened. Dr. Carter's tone was sinister, as though he suspected her prying. She realized that from now on, every move she made would need to be even more careful. The next day, Michael's private investigator brought a sudden breakthrough. They arranged a discreet meeting in a cafe across from the hospital. Hannah took a short break and slipped out, blending into the afternoon crowd. She found Michael seated in a corner booth, a newspaper spread before him, untouched coffee growing cold in its cup. The PI, a lean man named Hamilton with sharp features, spoke in a low murmur as Hannah approached. "Ms. Winters," Hamilton greeted, nodding politely. "We've uncovered some intriguing leads." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents detailing financial transfers linked to a small medical supply firm, one that had billed the hospital exorbitantly for certain sedatives and neurological suppressants. The payments were traced back to a shell company, and though the owners weren't named, partial signatures and coded transactions hinted at an insider's involvement. Hannah's stomach sank as she noticed patterns of ordering supplies that coincided with critical points in Clara's treatment. "What stands out," Hamilton continued, tapping a particular page, "is that the drugs appear targeted to maintain a patient's unconscious state. Expensive, specialized compounds wouldn't be routinely used without a good reason. Someone at the hospital authorized these orders through back channels. Given what you've told me, they're likely linked to Mrs. Anderson's prolonged condition." Michael tightened his jaw, knuckles pressing into the table. "Whoever is behind this is profiting financially, but ensuring Clara remains incapacitated." His voice wavered. I never imagined we'd be dealing with something so dark. Hannah's eyes drifted over the documents, names, and numbers blurring together. She forced herself to focus. Dr. Carter's name never appeared, but his schedule aligned with the anomalies. He'd been on duty during key medication shifts. Dr. Howard's name didn't appear in the logs. If anything, Hannah's recent conversation with him suggested he was as much in the dark as she had been. As they prepared to leave, Michael caught Hannah's elbow gently. I can't thank you enough. Without you, Clara would have no champion here. Please, be careful. His eyes held genuine fear. If they realize we're onto them, who knows what lengths they might go to protect themselves. Hannah kept her head down in the hospital, blending in with the routine. She pretended to be preoccupied with ordinary tasks, restocking linens, reviewing charts, while quietly comparing the PI's findings with her notes. Gradually, a picture formed. Dr. Carter, who once managed Clara's care before Dr. Howard stepped in hand with means and opportunity. His tight-lipped demeanor, his suspicious presence at odd hours, and the possibility that he had tampered with logs and medication orders pointed directly at him. But why Clara Anderson specifically? Hannah suspected money was only one piece of this puzzle. Perhaps Clara had discovered something incriminating and refused to stay silent, and Carter saw her vegetative state as the perfect cover-up. That night, Hannah decided to search for more solid evidence. Dr. Howard's reluctant support limited her access to certain medical storage areas. Under the guise of performing inventory checks, Hannah entered a supply closet connected to the central pharmacy, her heart pounding. She found unmarked boxes containing vials matching the suspicious medications in Hamilton's report. Some bore no official hospital stamps, and their serial numbers didn't align with the standard inventory. She snapped covert photographs with her phone, determined to build a strong case to hold up under scrutiny. As she slipped back toward Mrs. Anderson's room, footsteps echoed behind her. She pressed herself against a dim hallway wall, listening to the steady tread approach. Dr. Carter passed by, pausing only a few feet away. Hannah held her breath, heart hammering, terrified he might hear it. After a tense moment, he continued, humming softly to himself. The melody was chilling in its nonchalance. Inside room 214, Hannah let out a shaky breath and approached the bed. She took Clara's hand and whispered, "We're getting closer. I have proof now, and I won't let this go." She thought she felt the faintest squeeze, but couldn't be sure. Perhaps it was hope playing tricks on her mind. Still, even the idea of Clara responding fueled Hannah's determination. They were nearing a precipice. Soon, the evidence would be laid out for the proper authorities, and Dr. Carter's careful mask would shatter. Hannah only hoped that when that moment came, everyone would be safe, and Clara, at last, could begin the slow journey back to herself. The hospital's silence felt poised on a knife's edge, ready to explode into truth and consequence. Hannah clenched Clara's hand a moment longer before gently releasing it, stepping back into the shadows to prepare for what must come next. The next evening, as the moonlight slipped through the hospital's narrow windows, Hannah stood before Dr. Howard's office door, her hand hovering inches from the wood. He had asked her to come after hours, presumably to discuss the evidence she'd collected. The hallway was unsettlingly quiet. No distant chatter from the nurse's station, no hum of floor buffers. Even the elevators seemed to hold their breath. Dr. Howard opened the door before she could knock, beckoning her inside. His face was drawn, worry carving new lines around his eyes. He motioned for Hannah to sit while he shut the blinds and lowered the desk lamp. A folder lay on his desk, printouts of the photos Hannah had taken in the pharmacy storage room, side by side with medication logs and the financial documents supplied by Michael's investigator. "Hannah," he began softly, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "This is far more extensive than I imagined. These drugs, their sole purpose seems to be maintaining or deepening unconscious states, and it's clear someone arranged for them to be delivered off the record." He paused, letting out a long breath. "Given the evidence and the time frame, I have to agree with your suspicions. Dr. Carter is involved?" A heaviness settled in Hannah's chest. It was different, hearing the words spoken aloud by a respected physician. "We need to contact the authorities," she said, calm but urgent. "This can't continue. If Dr. Carter, or anyone else, Is keeping Clara in that state for profit or to cover something up? We must stop it. Dr. Howard nodded, but his eyes drifted to the closed door as though expecting someone to appear. I've already made discreet inquiries to a trusted colleague outside this hospital, someone with connections in the state medical board. If we time this right, we can bring the evidence directly to law enforcement. But we must be careful. If Carter suspects we're about to expose him, he may try to destroy records, threaten witnesses, or even harm Clara further. Hannah swallowed hard. Every moment Clara remained in that limbo was a moment of injustice. Yet Dr. Howard's caution was justified. They needed a plan. Together, they decided that Dr. Howard would discreetly invite a detective from the local police department to review the evidence within the hospital, quietly and under the radar. Michael and his investigator would provide the financial trail. Hannah would present the medical discrepancies and photographs. With all the pieces combined, Dr. Carter would have no plausible way to evade responsibility. As Hannah left Dr. Howard's office, she saw Dr. Carter in the hallway. He stood near the vending machine, tapping a candy bar against his palm, his gaze drifting toward her. When their eyes met, he offered a half-smile that felt more like a challenge. Hannah forced herself to remain composed. If he was watching her, he might already suspect something was amiss. She had to maintain her facade of calm professionalism, at least until the authorities were in place. When she returned to Clara's room, the tension in her body felt like coiled wire. She leaned over Clara, adjusting a corner of the blanket. "We're close," she whispered. "Please hold on. Soon, this will all come to light." Again, Clara's eyelids seemed to flutter faintly as if responding. Hannah took it as a sign. One way or another, the truth would be revealed. 2 days later, at dawn, the stage was set. The detective, a tall woman named Sergeant Phillips, arrived posing as a hospital consultant, blending in with the morning staff rush. She carried a leather portfolio and wore a calm, measured expression that immediately put Hannah at ease. Under Dr. Howard's guidance, Hannah led Sergeant Phillips to a small conference room on the second floor, neutral territory away from prying eyes. Michael arrived shortly after, wearing a simple sweater instead of his usual suit, a sign of how the stress had worn him down. He carried a laptop and several folders. Hamilton, the private investigator, joined them quietly, nodding to Hannah in respectful acknowledgement. They gathered around a circular table, laying out their evidence. Hannah's photographs, medication logs, suspicious financial transactions, and notes from Clara's journal. The combination painted a picture too dark to ignore. Sergeant Phillips examined the documents silently for a long moment, her brown eyes calm but intense. "This is serious," she said finally. "We have patterns of financial fraud, evidence of tampering with medication, and a strong motive to keep Mrs. Anderson unconscious. We must secure the pharmacy records, interview staff members, and locate hidden storage areas. We must act now before Dr. Carter realizes what we're doing." Hannah's heart thumped hard. They were finally moving. She escorted Sergeant Phillips to the pharmacy storage area, knowing Dr. Carter could appear any time. Just as they turned a corner, Hannah froze. There he was, standing near a supply closet. He stiffened upon seeing the group. Before he could slip away, Sergeant Phillips gestured to a nearby security guard. "Please ask Dr. Carter to step into the conference room," she said, calm but authoritative. Carter's eyes darted between them, realizing too late that he was cornered. He forced a smile. "Of course, is there an issue? I have patients to see." Sergeant Phillips did not explain, only a polite request that he come along. With no immediate escape, Carter complied, his knuckles whitening against the hem of his coat. In the conference room, the confrontation unfolded quietly, but with undeniable tension. Sergeant Phillips presented the evidence with measured clarity, leaving Dr. Carter no space to dismiss it. Hannah watched as his face paled. He attempted to deny involvement, claiming he'd only followed orders from unnamed superiors and had no knowledge of the financial dealings. But the detective, backed by Hamilton's methodical tracing of funds, closed every loophole. Michael stood by Hannah's side, trembling slightly, his anger and heartbreak palpable. "You kept my wife trapped in that state for gain, didn't you?" he accused, trembling. "What did she discover that made you do this?" Carter's mask slipped. He snarled. She wouldn't stay silent. She threatened to expose the embezzlement scheme involving the supply orders. I had no choice. If she woke up and told... He stopped, realizing he had confessed to enough wrongdoing to seal his fate. Sergeant Phillips nodded to the security guard, who arrested the doctor. As Carter was led away, Hannah released a breath she hadn't known she was holding. The weight of unspoken threats and nighttime corridors finally lifted. Within hours, administrative staff were contacted, official statements were taken, and the hospital board was informed. Dr. Howard offered apologies to Michael for not acting sooner. Hannah reassured him they wouldn't have cornered Carter as neatly without his final support and the detective's involvement. Later that evening, Hannah returned to Clara's bedside. The machines hummed softly, and a subtle glow from the streetlights traced patterns on the walls. "It's over," Hannah whispered, taking Clara's hand. "They can't hurt you anymore." This time, Clara's reaction was unmistakable. Her fingers twitched around Hannah's, gripping them with the faint but deliberate force of someone emerging from a long darkness. Hannah's heart soared. As she spoke softly, encouraging Clara to take her time and find her way back, she noticed Clara's eyes shifting beneath closed lids. In the background, Michael stood quietly, tears rolling down his cheeks. "We're here," he said softly to his wife. "We never stopped fighting for you." Hannah smiled, tears gathering at the corners of her own eyes. Soon, with the proper care and medications withdrawn, Clara might begin the slow awakening process. Justice had been served. The silent suffering would end, and Clara Anderson's voice, once silenced by greed and deceit, would be given a chance to speak again. The hospital halls, once filled with secrets, would now ring with the quiet, hopeful sound of healing and truth. In the days following Dr. Carter's arrest, a subtle shift graced the hospital's atmosphere. Once fraught with invisible tension, the corridors felt lighter, sunlit, almost hopeful. Nurses and doctors who had skirted around the mystery now approached Hannah with words of quiet gratitude, acknowledging the courage it took to expose a conspiracy hidden beneath hospital protocol, looking older but more at ease. Howard offered a sincere apology for his early reluctance. He stood before Hannah outside Mrs. Anderson's room one afternoon, arms folded, head bowed slightly. "I underestimated you," he said softly, voice subdued. "Your persistence saved Clara's life and reminded me why I chose medicine in the first place. We became too comfortable assuming that every line of text in a chart told a complete truth." His eyes met Hannah's, filled with respect. "Thank you for opening my eyes." Hannah accepted his words with a mixture of relief and pride. She had never aimed for recognition, only justice. Yet knowing she had restored some manner to this place, and given Clara a fighting chance, left her heart full. Inside room 214, a quiet miracle was unfolding. With the sedatives and manipulated medications discontinued, Clara Anderson's body began to respond in earnest. Michael sat at her bedside, reading aloud from a book he had brought home, which Clara used to read to their daughter many years ago. The words of old stories seemed to coax her back toward the present. Hannah adjusted the pillows, helped massage Clara's hands and feet, and encouraged gentle physical therapy exercises. Bit by bit, Clara's eyes fluttered more frequently, her fingers curled around offered hands, and her breathing shifted when familiar voices spoke close to her ear. One late afternoon, as autumn leaves turned copper gold outside the window, Clara opened her eyes fully. It was not a sudden awakening, but a gradual clarity. Michael was there, tears dampening his cheeks as he repeated her name. Hannah stood near the foot of the bed, holding her breath, heart pounding with hope. Clara's gaze drifted slowly as if reacquainting herself with the world. When she finally focused on Michael, a single tear escaped down her temple. Her lips parted, though words were not yet ready to form. That was all right. Words could wait. Hannah stepped forward, smiling, her own eyes wet. She gently touched Clara's hand and felt a faint return of pressure, as if Clara was saying thank you in the quiet language of touch. Over the next week, Clara made incremental progress. She began recognizing her husband's face, Hannah's, and Dr. Howard's gentle inquiries. Therapy sessions started slowly, helping Clara relearn simple movements and regain muscle strength that had faded during her long stillness. Her voice emerged in whispers at first, fragments of sentences, half-formed words. Michael's name came first, then thank you, directed at Hannah. Hope unfurled like a banner in all their hearts with every successful attempt. A month later, the hospital welcomed a brisk November morning. Outside, the last leaves clung stubbornly to old oak trees, and a pale sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Inside room 214, the atmosphere was transformed. No longer a chamber of secrets and subdued alarms, but a place of healing and renewal. Clara sat propped up against a mound of soft pillows. Though still weak, she managed short conversations, her voice quiet but determined. Michael hovered close, offering spoonfuls of broth and reading her short passages from her old journal, the one Hannah had discovered tucked among wilted flowers and faded memories. They laughed softly over old family anecdotes, paused in silence over more troubling entries, and promised each other a future without hidden truths. Hannah stopped by after her shift, bringing Clara a small bouquet of fresh flowers, lavender and chrysanthemums, and placing them in the windowsill vase. It had become a personal ritual, replacing the old wilted blooms with something vibrant and alive. Clara smiled, the expression still tentative but growing stronger daily. Thank you, Clara managed, voice still tinged with effort. You never gave up on me. Hannah swallowed the lump in her throat. You gave me a purpose I never knew I needed, she replied honestly. You reminded me that care means more than following charts. It means listening to what isn't said, watching for signs others overlook, and fighting for the patient's truth. Across town, Dr. Carter awaited trial. The authorities had amassed enough financial and medical evidence to ensure he would face severe consequences. With his downfall, the hospital board implemented stricter oversight measures and new checks and balances to prevent such corruption from taking root. Staff underwent additional training, learning the importance of transparency and ethical responsibility. The world moved on outside those hospital walls, but life had turned for the better for Hannah and the Anderson family. Clara steadily improved, regaining strength in limbs once thought forever inert and rediscovering her voice. She and Michael spoke quietly of the future. Family gatherings, slow walks in the garden once spring returned, and the simple comfort of holding hands without tubes and wires between them. As for Hannah, she continued her work in the hospital, but with a renewed sense of mission. She became a mentor to younger nurses, sharing the story of Clara's case as an example of perseverance, compassion, and moral courage. In whispers and grateful smiles, colleagues acknowledged Hannah's restoring integrity to their shared profession. On Clara's last evening as an inpatient, Hannah came by with a small gift, a leather-bound journal similar to the one Clara had once used. Hannah had written a short inscription on the front cover, "Your truth set you free. May you fill these pages with new memories, laughter, and a reclaimed life." Clara held the journal closed, her eyes meeting Hannah's. "We'll make sure no darkness like that ever takes hold," she promised, and though her voice was soft, it carried the firmness of someone who knew firsthand the cost of silence. Standing there, Hannah felt a quiet pride and a deep, warming gratitude. They had turned a corner together. The nurse, the patient, the husband, and even the hospital itself. Justice and hope had prevailed in that small, unremarkable room in a modest Midwestern hospital. The shadows had lifted, replaced by the glow of second chances. As Hannah entered the corridor, her thoughts drifted to the future. She imagined Clara walking hand in hand with Michael outside on a sunny day, the dull winter months giving way to gentle spring. She imagined a hospital staff more vigilant and united. She imagined herself more assertive and confident than ever, ready to face whatever challenges came next. In the stillness of that moment, between one heartbeat and the next, Hannah understood that this was not just an ending but a beginning. The truth had come to light, and all of them would find their way forward in its glow.